I stood in our apartment, a sleek box of glass and steel perched high above the city, when Ryan changed everything. The skyline glittered through the windows, a restless mosaic of lights, yellows bleeding into reds, a jagged pulse against the night. The room was all edges, sharp lines of chrome furniture, a countertop that gleamed like a blade, and those towering panes of glass that made the world below feel both vast and suffocatingly close. My bare feet pressed into the cool, polished floor, the chill seeping up my legs, grounding me as the air shifted. Ryan leaned against the counter, his frame loose but deliberate, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment. His voice came low, a thread of sound weaving through the hum of the city beyond the walls. "Michael likes you," he said, eyes flicking to mine, quick and cutting as a shard of light. "And I need that promotion." The words landed heavy, a stone dropped into still water, rippling out until the room felt unsteady. My chest tightened, ribs caging a sudden frantic thudding that I couldn't quiet. I caught the sharp edge of his cologne, sandalwood laced with something bitter, like citrus gone sour, and it clung to the back of my throat. He didn't move, just watched me, his jaw a firm line, his fingers resting too casually on the counter's edge. The suggestion hung there, unspoken but glaring. Get close to Michael, let the lines blur, trade something intangible for his gain. My reflection stared back from the polished floor, my outline warped, legs elongated, face a smudge of shadow, and I wondered how long he'd been planning this, how many nights he'd stood in this same spot, plotting while I slept. The city's glow pulsed against the glass, a living thing pressing in, and I crossed my arms, nails digging into my skin as if to anchor myself. My hair brushed my shoulders, a dark curtain against the pale sweater I wore, its wool soft but suddenly stifling. Ryan shifted, the faintest scrape of his shoe against the floor cutting through the silence, and I felt the weight of his expectations settle over me. He'd always been driven, late nights at the firm, the way his brow furrowed over spreadsheets, but this was different. This was a transaction, cold and calculated, and I was the currency. My tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, dry despite the glass of water I'd left untouched on the counter, its surface trembling faintly with the building's vibration. I stepped toward the window, needing distance, and the city sprawled out below, a grid of ambition, streets like veins feeding the towers that loomed over us. My breath fogged the glass, a fleeting cloud that vanished as quickly as it formed, and I felt the heat of my own exhales against my lips. Ryan's reflection joined mine in the pain, his shape distorted by the angle. Taller, broader, a stranger wearing his face. "It's just business," he'd said earlier that week about a deal gone sour, but now those words twisted, coiling around this moment. My fingers curled against the window's edge, the metal frame biting into my palms, and I turned to face him. His eyes were steady, unyielding, but there was a flicker there, something hungry, almost pleading. The overhead lights cast his features in stark relief, hollows under his cheekbones, a faint sheen on his forehead. My stomach churned, a slow roil that climbed up my chest, and I wondered if he saw me at all. Emily, 32, with tired eyes and a laugh he used to chase, or just a means to an end. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and I felt the pull of his gaze, urging me to nod, to agree, to step into the role he'd carved out. My reflection in the floor shifted as I moved, a fractured version of myself stretching toward him, and I stopped short, heels digging into the hardwood. "How long have you thought about this?" I asked, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He didn't answer right away, just tilted his head, a half smile tugging at his lips like he'd expected the question. "Long enough," he said finally, the words clipped, and I felt them slice through me, precise as a blade. The faucet dripped in the kitchen, a single, hollow note that echoed in the quiet, and I realized he'd already decided my answer for me. My throat tightened, a knot I couldn't swallow, and I looked back at the window, at the city that never slept. Its lights flickered, a restless dance, and I wondered what it would cost to step into his game. what I'd see in the reflections tomorrow if I did. The room held its breath, the hum of the heater kicking on a distant rumble, and I felt the weight of his plan settle into my bones. My fingers flexed, nails leaving crescent marks in my palms, and I turned away from the glass, from him. The counter's edge caught my hip as I passed, a dull ache blooming there, and I didn't look back. Not yet. But the seed was planted, and as I moved toward the hall, the polished floor threw my reflection back at me, sharp, unsteady, and already shifting into something I didn't recognize. Monday morning, the office thrummed with the steady hum of ambition, glass walls, gray carpets, and the faint clack of keyboards weaving a rhythm that pulsed through their floor. I'd chosen a short dress that morning, its hem brushing my thighs, the fabric clinging as I moved, a deep red that caught the light and held it. It was for Michael's eyes, a silent answer to Ryan's nudge echoing in my skull. Get close. My heels clicked against the tiles as I crossed the open floor, the sound sharp against the muted drone of voices, phones, and printers. The air carried a sterile chill, laced with the faint tang of toner and coffee, and I felt it settle against my bare legs, raising the fine hairs there. My reflection flashed in the glass partitions as I passed. Long limbs, a sway in my step, a woman testing the edges of a game she hadn't yet agreed to play. His desk sat at the far end, a throne of dark wood and chrome that dominated the space, its surface polished to a sheen that threw back the fluorescent glow. Michael was there, bent over a stack of papers, his broad shoulders straining the lines of his suit jacket. When he looked up, his gaze caught mine and held, too long, too deliberate, tracing the curve of my hips, the dip of my waist, the way the dress hugged my frame. My breath snagged. A quick hitch I masked by adjusting my bag on my shoulder. He reached for his coffee, fingers brushing the cup, a slow, careless motion, and the faint clink of porcelain against the saucer jolted me, a sound that cut through the office's hum like a snapped thread. My skin tightened, a flush creeping up my neck, warm and unbidden, as if his look had pressed itself into me. I moved closer, pretending to check a file on a nearby table, and felt the weight of his attention shift with me. The desk's surface mirrored my silhouette, bold and uncertain, my outline trembling faintly with the vibration of the building. Ryan's words looped through my mind. Get close, get close. And I wondered if this was what he'd pictured, me standing here, pulse quickening under Michael's stare. My fingers brushed the edge of the table, the wood cool and smooth, and I caught the scent of his aftershave drifting across the space. Cedar, crisp and commanding. The office buzzed around us, a hive of motion and sound, but it faded to a dull roar as I glanced his way again. His eyes hadn't moved, dark and steady, and the corner of his mouth twitched, a hint of something I couldn't name. The day stretched on, a slow grind of emails and meetings, and I felt his presence like a current beneath it all. My dress felt tighter with every hour, the fabric pulling against my ribs as I breathed, my legs crossing and uncrossing under my desk. The glass walls threw back fractured glimpses of me, head bent over a screen, hair falling across my cheek, and I wondered if he saw them too. My neck prickled, a sensation I couldn't shake, and I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, feeling the heat of my own skin through the thin material. The clock ticked toward evening, the light outside shifting to a bruised purple, and I gathered my things, the rustle of my bag loud in the thinning crowd. He caught me at the elevator, his shadow falling across the carpet as he stepped close. The doors slid open with a soft chime, but I didn't move, rooted by the sudden nearness of him. His tie was loosened, the knot slumping against his chest, and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with quiet strength. That dress, he said, voice low and teasing, carrying a quiet edge that made my stomach tilt. Suits you more than this place does. My lips parted, but no sound came. Only a rush of air as I felt the words settle against me, light as a touch. He leaned in, just enough that I caught the warmth radiating from him, and added, "Dinner tomorrow. My pick." It wasn't a question, and the way his gaze lingered, tracing the hem where it grazed my thighs, told me he knew I wouldn't say no. The elevator doors closed behind me as I stepped inside, my reflection staring back from the mirrored walls, cheeks flushed, eyes wide, the red dress a vivid slash against the steel. My fingers tightened around my bag, nails digging into the leather, and I felt the hum of the descent in my bones. The office faded above me, but Michael's voice lingered, a thread I couldn't cut. Ryan's plan had taken root, but as the city lights streaked past the lobby windows, I realized the ground beneath me was shifting, tilting towards something I hadn't mapped out. My heels echoed in the empty hall as I stepped outside, the night air sharp against my skin, and I wondered what I'd see in the reflections tomorrow, after I said yes. Michael called it a work dinner, but the rooftop restaurant felt far from professional. The elevator had spit us out onto a terrace of sleek black tiles and low lights, the city sprawling beneath us, a pulsing grid of amber and white that throbbed like a living thing. The air hung thick, heavy with the threat of rain and the rich, earthy bite of roasted garlic drifting from the kitchen. I'd worn the red dress again, its hem riding high, the fabric catching the breeze as I crossed to the table. Michael sat across from me, jacket off, tossed over the chair's back, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the taut lines of his forearms. The candle between us flickered, casting shadows that danced across his knuckles, and when his knee brushed mine under the table, a fleeting pressure, firm and warm, heat curled through me, a slow coil that tightened low in my belly. The wine glass felt cool against my palm, its contents a deep crimson that stung my tongue, tart and warm, cutting through the haze of the evening. He leaned back, one arm draped over his chair, and talked about quarterly projections, numbers I barely tracked. His voice rolled over me, steady and deep, but my focus snagged on the way his knee shifted, grazing mine again, deliberate this time. The contact lingered, a quiet claim, and my thighs pressed together, the dress's edge sliding higher. The city lights pulsed beyond the railing, a restless heartbeat, and his slow smile unfurled, drowning out the clatter of plates and the murmur of other tables. My reflection wavered in the wine's surface, lips parted, eyes dark, and I felt Ryan's eager nod flash in my mind, his silhouette at the apartment door as I'd left, urging me into this. The night deepened, the air growing damp as clouds thickened overhead. Waiters moved like shadows, clearing plates, refilling glasses, and I traced the rim of mine with a fingertip, the glass humming faintly under my touch. Michael's gaze followed the motion, then lifted to my face, holding there until my chest tightened, a quick, sharp pull. The garlic scent faded, replaced by the crisp edge of his cologne as he leaned closer, elbows on the table now, his rolled sleeves brushing the cloth. My skin prickled, a flush blooming across my collarbone, and I shifted in my seat, the chair's metal frame cold against my bare calves. The city below buzzed, its hum seeping up through the floor, and I felt it in my bones, a rhythm that matched the unsteady thud beneath my ribs. Late in the evening, the wine had dulled my edges, and I excused myself, heels clicking as I crossed to the restroom. The space was all marble and mirrors, the air cool against my flushed cheeks. I leaned against the sink, my reflection staring back, hair mussed, dress clinging, a woman teetering on a line I'd drawn myself. My fingers hesitated, then slid beneath the hem, tugging the thin lace of my panties down my legs. The fabric pooled at my ankles, a whisper of black against the tiles, and I stepped out, folding it into my fist. The act felt reckless, a spark igniting in my core, and I pressed my lips together, tasting the wine's residue as I returned to the table. He watched me approach, eyes narrowing as I slid into my seat. I reached across, my hand brushing his, and pressed the lace into his palm. His fingers closed around it, slow and sure, the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth betraying his calm. My pulse surged, a wild tempo, and I stood again, pulling my phone from my bag. I'm calling a taxi, I said, voice steady despite the heat flooding my neck. He didn't protest, just leaned back, the panties vanishing into his pocket as he watched me go. The night air hit me outside, damp and sharp, and I slid into the cab, the leather seat cool against my thighs. The city lights streaked past, a blur of color through the rain-slicked windows, and my reflection flickered in the glass. Bold, unsteady, a woman who'd just tossed a match into dry grass. The driver said something about traffic, his voice a distant hum, but I barely heard. My fingers curled into my palms, nails biting skin, and I felt the absence of the lace, a quiet thrill threading through me. The taxi wove through the streets, tires hissing on wet pavement, and the skyline loomed behind us, its glow fractured by the drizzle. Michael's face lingered in my mind, those fingers closing, that almost smile, and I wondered what he'd do with what I'd left behind. Ryan's nod replayed too, eager and blind, and my lips curved, a secret tucked into the motion. The cab stopped outside our building, the engine idling, and I stepped out, heels splashing in a shallow puddle. The glass doors reflected me as I approached. Red dress, wild eyes, and I felt the night shift, tilting towards something I couldn't yet name. 2 days after the restaurant, the office was quiet, the city's glow filtering through the blinds as we worked late. The hum of ambition had faded with the exodus of daylight, leaving behind a hush pierced only by the occasional creak of the building settling into night. Papers littered the conference table, blueprints unfurled like maps of some uncharted place, scribbled notes curling at the edges, and I stood beside Michael, the red dress swapped for a fitted skirt and blouse, the fabric taut across my shoulders. The air buzzed, thick with the dry scent of ink and the crisp bite of his aftershave, a scent that clung to the space between us. My hair grazed my neck, loose from its earlier knot, and I felt the weight of the silence, heavy as the city pressing against the glass walls. He'd asked me to stay, citing deadlines, but the room felt too small for just work. The blinds sliced the outside light into thin golden bars, casting stripes across the carpet that stretched long and lean, pooling at our feet. I traced a line on the blueprint, my pencil trembling faintly, when Michael's hand steadied mine. His fingers were warm, firm, the pads rough against my skin, as he guided me to a detail I'd missed, a corner I'd overlooked. The contact lingered, his touch a quiet anchor, and my breath caught, snared in the narrow space between us. My chest tightened, a quick, sharp pull, and I felt the heat of him radiate, close enough that the sleeve of his shirt brushed my arm. Shadows danced across the carpet, shifting as he moved, and my fingers tightened on the paper, knuckles paling against the stark white. The blueprints crinkled under my grip, a faint protest, and I smelled the coffee on his breath, bitter and warm, mingling with the aftershave that clouded my senses. He leaned in, his voice a low hum against my ear, words about angles and measurements that blurred into a tone I felt more than heard. My neck prickled, a flush climbing my throat, and I tilted my head just enough to catch his reflection in the glass walls. Two shapes teetering on a precipice, my outline soft against his sharper edges. Ryan's plan thrummed in my mind. A distant echo, get close. But it was mine now, twisting into something I'd claimed. The city beyond the blinds pulsed, its glow a restless tide that seeped into the room, and I shifted, the skirt pulling tight across my thighs. My free hand brushed the table's edge, wood cool and smooth under my palm, and I felt the vibration of the building in my bones. A low, steady thrum that matched the racing beneath my ribs. Michael's hand didn't move, still pressed over mine, and I wondered if he felt it too. The current arcing between us, unspoken but alive. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, a sound I hadn't noticed until it filled the quiet, and I looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, steady, the faintest crease at their corners, hinting at something held back. Time stretched, the seconds pooling like ink, and then he shifted closer, his shadow swallowing mine. My lips parted, a breath escaping as his face tilted toward me, and then his mouth found mine. The kiss was sudden, firm, tasting of coffee and intent, a slow press that deepened as his hand slid from the paper to my wrist, fingers curling there. Heat flooded me, a rush that started at my core and surged upward, leaving my pulse racing in my ears. My tongue brushed his, a fleeting dance, and I tasted the bitter edge of his drink, the warmth of him seeping into me. The glass walls threw back our reflection, heads bent, bodies angled, a moment caught in amber, and I felt the world tilt, the floor unsteady beneath my heels. He pulled back first, just enough that I felt the cool air rush in, and my eyes fluttered open meeting his. His breath was uneven, a quiet hitch, and his fingers lingered on my wrist, thumb tracing a line that sent a jolt through me. My lips tingled, swollen from the pressure, and I tasted him still, a ghost on my tongue. The blueprints lay forgotten, creased where I'd gripped them, and the city's glow pulsed against the blinds, a witness to the shift. My skirt felt tighter, the blouse clinging to my damp skin, and I stepped back, the heel of my shoe catching the carpet. "We should finish this," he said, voice rough, nodding at the papers, but his eyes stayed on me, dark and unyielding. I nodded, a jerky motion, and turned to the table, my hands trembling as I smoothed the blueprints flat. The air still buzzed, thick with what we'd done, and my reflection in the glass wavered, cheeks flushed, hair wild, a woman who'd crossed a line. Ryan's face flickered in my mind, his nod from that first night, but it felt distant, a shadow eclipsed by the heat still coursing through me. Michael moved beside me, his presence a quiet storm, and I felt the kiss linger, a mark I couldn't erase. The city hummed beyond the walls, alive and restless, and I wondered what came next, how deep this precipice ran. Ryan waited up, sprawled on the couch when I got home, the city's hum seeping through the walls like a restless tide. The apartment was dim, the glow from the skyline spilling through the windows, painting the room in slivers of gold and shadow. My heels clicked against the hardwood as I dropped my bag, the sound sharp in the quiet, and I felt the weight of the night clinging to me, the kiss still warm on my lips, Michael's touch a phantom on my wrist, Ryan's head tilted toward me, his frame loose against the cushions, one leg slung over the armrest. "How's it going with Michael?" he asked, voice light, fingers tapping a restless beat against the fabric. The casualness of it grated, a thin veneer over something coiled beneath. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, the blouse still clinging to my skin from the office's heat. My skirt hugged my hips, the fabric creased from the day, and I felt the air shift as I met his gaze. "We kissed," I said, the words slipping out steady, testing him. His eyes lit up, a strange excitement flickering there, bright and jagged like a cracked bulb. My stomach tilted, a slow lurch, and I watched him unfold from the couch, his movements fluid but eager. The kitchen faucet dripped, a relentless beat that punctuated the silence, each drop a hollow note against the sink. He crossed the room, socks silent on the floor, and stopped close. Too close, his hands finding my waist with a grip that dug into my flesh. The counter's edge bit into my palms as he lifted me, a quick, sure motion that set me atop it, the cold stainless steel pressing into my thighs through the skirt. My breath caught, a quick snag, and I felt the chill seep into my skin, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from him. His hands slid down, fingers splaying over my hips, and he stepped between my legs, his chest brushing mine. The faucet's drip echoed, a metronome to his eagerness, and he took me there, movements sharp and almost triumphant, like a man staking a claim on ground he'd already ceded. My blouse rode up, the fabric bunching under his palms, and I braced myself, hands flat against the counter, nails scraping the smooth surface. The stainless steel reflected us, him hungry, eyes wild with a gleam I hadn't seen before, me steady, my face a calm mask despite the storm beneath. My thighs tensed, muscles tightening as he pressed closer, and I felt the city's hum vibrate through the walls, a low thrum that matched the pulse racing in my veins. The air carried his scent, sweat and the faint musk of his soap, mixing with the metallic tang of the counter, and I tilted my head back, hair brushing my shoulders. The overhead light cast us in harsh relief, shadows pooling under his jaw, and I felt the shift. His game, his rules, but I'd rewritten them. My lips curved, a quiet edge to the motion, and I wondered if he saw it, the power tilting toward me. His breath came fast, ragged against my neck, and I felt the countertop's cold bite deepen, a dull ache spreading where it pressed my skin. The faucet's rhythm faltered, then steadied, a sound I clung to as the room spun with his urgency. My reflection flickered in the steel, cheeks flushed, eyes dark, a woman holding the reins even as she let them slacken. Ryan's hands tightened, fingers digging into my waist, and I let him move, let him chase that strange triumph. But my mind drifted to Michael's kiss, the way it lingered, a taste I couldn't shake. The city beyond the glass pulsed, its lights a restless dance, and I felt my own pulse steady, a calm beneath his storm. He slowed, chest heaving, and stepped back, hands falling to his sides. The counter's chill lingered on my thighs, a sharp reminder as I slid down, smoothing my skirt with palms that trembled faintly. His eyes followed me, still bright, still hungry, and he said he'd known Michael would bite, his voice thick with satisfaction. I turned to the sink, the faucet's drip louder now, and ran my fingers under the water, the cold biting my skin. The stainless steel threw back our shapes, him slouched, me upright, and I felt the shift settle into my bones. His plan had sparked this, but I'd fanned the flame. My lips tasted of salt and him, a fleeting mark, and I wiped them with the back of my hand, the motion deliberate. The room held its breath, the city's hum a constant thread, and I moved past him, bare feet silent on the floor. My reflection in the window caught my eye. Hair mussed, blouse wrinkled, a woman who'd bent but not broken. Ryan sank back onto the couch, fingers raking through his hair, and I felt his gaze linger as I headed for the hall. The counter's edge had left a faint red line across my thighs, a quiet ache, and I carried it with me, a badge of the night. The game was his once, but the rules were mine now, and as the city glowed beyond the glass, I wondered how far I'd let them stretch. Michael called me into his office the next day, the door clicking shut, with a finality that hung in the air, a lock snapping into place against the world outside. His space was leather and chrome, a corner kingdom overlooking the city's jagged teeth. The skyline a restless sprawl of steel and light clawing at the towering glass. The scent of polished wood tangled with his, cedar and a faint wisp of smoke, curling into my lungs as I stood there, heels sinking into the thick carpet. I'd chosen trousers, their fabric clinging to my legs, and a blouse that hugged my frame, its collar grazing my neck. My arms stayed loose, fingers flexing as the tension thickened, charged and heavy, a storm brewing in the stillness. He loosened his tie, the fabric rustling as he tugged it free, letting it dangle against his chest like a signal unfurled. His jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled up, and he stepped closer, his shadow spilling across the desk's polished gleam. "You're good at this," he said, voice low and rough, meaning more than the reports I'd carried in, and my throat tightened, a knot I couldn't ease. My fingers brushed my trousers, restless, and I felt the pull of him, sharp, alive, tugging at the edges of me. His cufflinks glinted, tiny beacons in the dim light, catching the city's glow, and I saw it clear. Ryan's scheme had unraveled, rewoven into something that was ours alone. The air hummed, thick with leather and the building's quiet drone, and I shifted, the carpet yielding under my heels. The desk's edge loomed behind me, papers stacked in tight rows, their corners curling in the dry heat. Michael's gaze pinned me, dark and steady, and I felt it sink into me, a pressure that made my chest ache. My reflection flickered in the chrome armrest, hair loose, eyes shadowed, and I saw a woman stepping into a current she'd ignited. The city's pulse throbbed beyond the glass, a restless beat seeping into the room, and I felt it quicken in my veins, a rhythm building with every step he took. He stopped close, shoes brushing the carpet beside mine, and the air between us sparked, a live wire humming with intent. My lips parted, a breath slipping free, and I caught the coffee on him, bitter and warm, a trace from the mug abandoned on his desk. His hand hovered near my arm, then settled, a slow graze of fingers against my elbow that sent a jolt through me, bright and sudden. My neck flushed, warmth climbing my jaw, and I tilted my head, hair grazing my cheek as I held his gaze. The pull tightened, a thread stretched taut since the restaurant, since the kiss, and I knew it was ours now, a tide we couldn't resist. The room softened, the city's glow a muted haze beyond the windows, and he stepped closer, his chest brushing mine. My hands rose, palms finding the planes of his shirt, the fabric warm and taut under my touch. He said the reports could wait, his voice a low rumble, but it faded as he leaned in, breath fanning my ear. The tension coiled, a spring wound tight, and I felt the desk's edge press into my hip as I leaned back, drawing him in. His hands found my waist, firm and steady, and the city's hum dimmed, swallowed by the sound of my pulse racing in my ears. Time blurred, the seconds pooling into a quiet storm, and we moved, slow at first, then urgent. My blouse parted under his fingers, buttons slipping free, the fabric sliding down my shoulders to bare the curve of my collarbone. I tugged at his shirt, buttons popping loose, revealing the heat of his chest, the faint sheen of sweat glistening there. He lifted me to the desk's edge, papers crinkling beneath me, and my trousers tightened as I hooked my legs around his waist, pulling him close. The air cooled my skin where the blouse gapped, raising fine hairs along my arms, and I arched into him, feeling the desk's hard edge bite into my thighs. His hands roamed, one sliding up my back, fingers splaying wide to press me closer, the other gripping my hip, anchoring me as he moved. By the end we made love, a rhythm of tangled breaths and quiet gasps that filled the room. My nails dug into his shoulders, tracing the tense lines of muscle, and I felt the heat of him against me, his chest pressing mine, the fabric of his open shirt brushing my skin. The desk rocked faintly, a low creak beneath us, and I tasted him, coffee, salt, a deeper warmth, as our mouths met again, slow and searching. My legs tightened around him, the trouser seams digging into my flesh, and I felt the city's pulse beyond the glass sync with ours, steady, then wild, a cadence trembling through my core. His breath hitched, warm against my neck, and I tilted my head back, hair spilling across the desk, catching on scattered papers. The leather chair creaked nearby, his tie a crumpled heap on the floor, and I felt the desk's edge leave a faint ache in my thighs, grounding me. My blouse hung loose, trousers pushed aside, and the air brushed my damp skin, a chill against the heat still flooding me. His cufflinks glinted, a flash in the dimness, and I felt his hands linger, one on my waist, the other tracing my jaw. As he steadied himself, the windows reflected us, disheveled, fused, a single shape in the glass, and I knew it. What began as Ryan's scheme was ours now, etched into this moment. The city hummed on, a restless witness, and I held the weight of it, a claim I'd made my own. Ryan caught me outside our building that night, rain streaking the pavement, neon signs bleeding color into the dark, a wash of pink and blue smearing the wet asphalt. The downpour roared, a steady hiss that drowned the city's hum, and I stood under the awning, water tapping the glass above me in a frantic rhythm. My blouse clung to my skin, damp from the sprint through the drizzle, and my trousers stuck to my legs, the fabric heavy and cold. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust, sharp against my lungs, and I felt the weight of the day. Michael's touch, the desk's edge, still thrumming through me as Ryan stepped into view, his shape cutting through the haze. "What's going on?" he demanded. voice slicing through the downpour, raw and jagged like a blade pulled too fast. His hair clung to his forehead, plastered flat by the rain, and his eyes burned, wild with jealousy or need. I couldn't tell. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening, and his jacket hung open, soaked through, the fabric flapping as he moved. Water beaded on his face, trickling down his jaw, and I watched it pool at his collar, a faint gleam under the neon glow. My heels shifted on the slick pavement, the awning's edge dripping a steady line behind me, and I felt my lips curve, a quiet triumph rising, warm and steady in my chest. He'd pushed me to Michael, his eager nod a spark that lit this fire, but I'd claimed it, fanned it into something he couldn't touch. The rain sheeted down, a curtain blurring the street, and I stood still, the glass above me trembling with each drop. My reflection wavered in the wet windows, hair slicked back, eyes dark, a woman carved from the storm, and I saw him mirrored there too, a blur of frustration, his edges fraying. He stepped closer, shoes splashing in a shallow puddle, and the air between us thickened, heavy with the scent of rain and his sweat. His intent was clear. He wanted to take me rough, right there, his hands twitching as if to grab me, to pin me against the wall. My pulse quickened, a fleeting jolt, but I shook my head, a small, firm motion that stopped him cold. "Not here," I said, voice low, cutting through the rain's roar, and turned away, the awning's edge brushing my shoulder. The water tapped on, a relentless beat, and I felt the chill seep deeper, my blouse sticking to my back, the trousers chafing my thighs. His breath hitched, a ragged sound swallowed by the storm, and I sensed his fists tighten, the tension rolling off him in waves. The neon signs pulsed, their light fracturing in the wet glass, and I caught our reflections again. Him frozen, me unyielding, the rain a wall rising between us. I moved toward the building's doors, heels clicking on the pavement, each step a deliberate echo in the downpour. My hand brushed the handle, cold and slick, and I felt the ache from the desk linger in my thighs, a quiet mark of the day. Ryan's voice came again, softer now, asking what I'd done with Michael. But the rain washed it away, a murmur lost to the night. My hair dripped, strands clinging to my neck, and I pushed inside, the lobby's warmth hitting me like a wave. The glass doors swung shut, their surface reflecting him still standing there, hair plastered, fists slack, a man unraveling in the storm. The elevator hummed as I stepped in, the mirrored walls throwing back my shape, blouse translucent, trousers dark with wet, a woman who'd turned the game on its head. My fingers brushed my lips, tasting rain and a faint trace of Michael, and I felt that triumph settle, a steady glow beneath my ribs. The city's pulse thrummed beyond the walls, muted by the glass, and I leaned against the rail, the metal cool against my palm. Ryan's wild eyes lingered in my mind, his need a shadow I'd left outside, and I wondered if he felt the shift, if he knew the rules had bent beyond his reach. The door slid open, the hall stretching quiet and dim, and I stepped out, shoes leaving faint wet prints on the tile. My reflection followed in the windows, a silhouette against the city's glow, sharp and sure, and I carried the night with me, rain-soaked and heavy. The apartment waited, its silence a stark contrast to the storm, and I paused at the door, hand on the knob. The ache in my thighs pulsed, a reminder of Michael, and I felt my lips curve again, a quiet claim. Ryan would be there soon, dripping and restless, but this moment was mine, unyielding, unbroken, a wall of my own making.